All right, let's just dive right in. You know how a Joe Rogan podcast can be, right? It's like a 3-hour free fall into history, conspiracies, comedy, the whole shebang. So we went down the rabbit hole on this really fascinating conversation he had with comedian Ralph Barboza, and we've pulled out the most surprising interconnected ideas. We're going to start with UFOs, and we're going to end up talking about the very nature of human stupidity.
And this is the perfect place to start. This quote from Rogan. The idea that a story can be incredibly compelling whether you actually believe it or not. And that's the perfect setup for our first big mystery. A guy who says he was abducted by a UFO and whose friends, for over 40 years, have sworn up and down they saw the whole thing happen.
So, picture this. We're in Arizona. It's 1975. You've got a group of hardworking loggers just driving home after a long day. And then they see something in the sky that just changes everything. This is the truly strange and, somehow, enduring case of Travis Walton. I mean, just try to wrap your head around the absolute chaos of that first day. The crew sees a glowing disc. Travis Walton, for some reason, gets out and gets closer and gets zapped by a beam of light. His friends, understandably, are terrified and they peel out. But then, their conscience kicks in. They circle back to get him, and he's just gone. A 5-day manhunt turns up absolutely nothing. Then, just as mysteriously as he vanished, Walton is back, telling this unbelievable story about being on a spaceship.
And this is where the story gets so sticky. What makes it so hard to just dismiss? On the one hand, you gotta be skeptical, right? Rogan points out that Walton had literally gotten into a fist fight with another logger that same day. So why on earth would his rival back up this insane, life-ruining lie? But then, on the other hand, these were, as Rogan put it, hard men. They weren't known for making stuff up. And all 7 of them have told the exact same story without changing it for decades. It's a total paradox. So that feeling, right? That sense of an unsolvable mystery, it actually connects perfectly to the next stop on our journey. We're leaving the woods of Arizona and heading for the skies over the Pacific Northwest to talk about one of the most legendary heists in American history, the tale of D.B. Cooper. The plan itself was just so audacious. It's 1971. A guy who calls himself Dan Cooper hijacks a whole Boeing jet. He says he has a bomb, trades all the passengers for cash and some parachutes, and then tells the pilots to fly towards Mexico City. But here's the crazy part. Shortly after they take off again, he jumps out of the back of the plane with all the money, somewhere over a dense, pitch-black forest, and just vanishes. Never seen again. So the big question for decades has been, was this guy a brilliant, meticulous genius, or was he just nuts? The genius argument is pretty strong. By jumping out early, he completely fooled the FBI. But Rogan floats a much, much wilder theory, that this was a meth move. And honestly, when you think about it, jumping from a plane going 500 miles an hour, 10,000 feet up, into a dark forest full of giant trees, that doesn't really sound like a brilliant plan, does it? It sounds like a terrible, drug-fueled idea. And believe it or not, that one theory, that D.B. Cooper was just a meth head, that's the key. That's what unlocks this next, much, much bigger rabbit hole. Because suddenly, we're not talking about one criminal anymore. We're talking about the widespread, state-sponsored use of drugs to fuel actual wars. This is the pivot point. This is it. Rogan's just spitballing here, thinking about some crazy, wild dude. But that one thought opens the door to a documented global phenomenon. What if the kind of recklessness we see in the D.B. Cooper case wasn't just some one-off thing, but an actual military strategy?
And the perfect example of this? Pervitin. And no, this wasn't some back-alley drug. This was a mass-produced, over-the-counter methamphetamine pill. The Nazis handed out millions of these things to their soldiers in World War II, and they did it specifically to make them more aggressive, more confident, and able to fight for days without any sleep. And that's not a theory. That is a straight-up historical fact. And it was far from just the Nazis, not even close. This practice is global and it spans centuries. The Japanese gave meth to their kamikaze pilots. The U.S. military itself handed out 200 million amphetamine pills during World War II. More recently, you have ISIS fighters using a stimulant called Captagon.
and some child soldiers in Africa being given this awful mix of cocaine and gunpowder. It goes all the way back to the Civil War, using booze for liquid courage. It seems like using drugs to get an edge in war is as old as war itself.
Okay, so let's take a breath. If human beings are willing to use any tool, even hard drugs, just to get an advantage in a fight, what's driving us to fight in the first place? This is where the whole conversation gets really philosophical, digging deep into the roots of what makes us go to war.
And when you boil it all down, the argument they make is that most human conflict isn't really about all the complex ideologies we tell ourselves. No, it's about a primal, animalistic scramble for just two things: resources, like land and oil, and mates.
So to get at that mates part of the equation, they bring up this really provocative and, pretty controversial theory. The idea is that, biologically speaking, 100% of women are basically all attracted to the same top 20% of men. Now, if that's even close to true, it creates this massive imbalance, right? It leaves the other 80% of guys competing for almost no romantic attention. So what happens to that other 80%? Well, Ralph Barboza connects the dots with this incredibly blunt summary. If you're not in that top tier, what's left for you to do to prove your value, to find status? Well, according to this really dark logic, you just go to war. It becomes the ultimate outlet. So, if our own primal instincts, this drive for resources and reproduction, if that's the core of the problem, can we actually fix ourselves? This is the final, most sci-fi turn in the entire rabbit hole. Can we literally engineer a better human being?
And they float two radical, almost opposite solutions. First, you've got the organic route, what Rogan kind of jokes could be a vaccine for human stupidity. Mandatory psilocybin mushrooms to make us less aggressive and greedy. And then you have the synthetic option, a benevolent AI, a superintelligence that could maybe guide us and solve all our problems. Or, in a much darker turn, it could just decide that the human race is obsolete and get rid of us.
And that leaves us right here. We went from a 40-year-old UFO story to a daredevil skyjacker to meth-fueled Nazis, all the way to a man-made god. And it all exposed these fascinating, often pretty dark patterns in how we behave. Which brings us to the final looming question. Can we actually engineer a way out of our own worst instincts? Or, in trying to cure ourselves, do we risk creating something far, far worse than the disease?